Imagine you are a soldier. You've been trained for years to operate the biggest, most powerful artillery guns in the US Army. Now, it's the dead of winter, 1944. The German war machine has just launched a massive surprise attack, shattering the American front line. White infantry divisions all around you are in full retreat, a chaotic scramble for survival. But your unit, a Black Artillery Battalion, is given a different order. Stay. You are ordered to stand your ground and fire your cannons until the very last shell is gone, to become a human shield, a sacrificial wall of steel to cover the retreat of the same army that has segregated and disrespected you your entire career. You are being left behind to die. This is not the story of a battle. This is the story of a sacrifice so profound and a crime so vicious that it was buried by history for over half a century. Before they became the sacrificial heroes of the Battle of the Bulge, the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion were a symbol of the deep and painful contradictions of a segregated America at war. To understand their ultimate sacrifice, we must first understand the systemic bigotry they were forced to battle long before they ever saw a German soldier. When America entered World War II, it presented itself to the world as the arsenal of democracy, a nation fighting against the tyranny and master race ideology of Nazi Germany. But within its own borders, and especially within its own military, America practiced a rigid system of racial supremacy that was eerily similar in principle to the enemy it was fighting. The United States military of the early 1940s was a fortress of segregation. The War Department, influenced by a series of pseudo-scientific studies from the World War I era, had officially concluded that black men were unfit for combat. These reports, filled with racist caricatures, claimed that black soldiers were cowardly, unintelligent, overly emotional, and lacked the capacity for leadership and the mastery of complex technology. Based on this doctrine, the vast majority of the nearly 1 million African Americans who served in the war were relegated to non-combat service roles. They were the truck drivers, the cooks, the stevedores, the men who built the roads and dug the latrines, the logistical backbone of the war, but a backbone that was kept intentionally far from the glory of the front lines. The world of artillery was considered particularly off-limits. Operating a massive 155mm howitzer was a science. It required complex mathematical calculations to determine trajectory, a deep understanding of ballistics, and the disciplined, clockwork teamwork of a tightly knit crew. These were skills that the Army's white leadership simply did not believe black men possessed. The idea of an all-black artillery unit was, to many generals, a dangerous and laughable proposition. But the sheer scale of World War II, a global conflict that demanded an unprecedented mobilization of manpower, began to bend the rigid rules of segregation. The Army needed bodies, millions of them. And so, reluctantly, and more out of necessity than any moral awakening, the decision was made to form a limited number of all-black combat units, including artillery battalions. The 333rd Field Artillery was one of these creations, an experiment born of reluctant compliance. Formed in 1942 at Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, its existence was a paradox from day one. It was a unit created to prove a negative, a test case that many in the high command fully expected, and perhaps even hoped would fail. The men who filled its ranks came from all corners of the country, drawn by a mixture of patriotism and a burning desire to prove the racist doctrines of their own army wrong. They were sharecroppers from Mississippi, factory workers from Detroit, students from Howard University. They knew that they were carrying a burden that no white soldier had to bear. They were not just fighting for their country. They were fighting for the very right to be considered full men in the eyes of that country. Their performance would be used to judge not just themselves, but their entire race. This immense pressure forged a unique and powerful sense of purpose within the unit. They had to be better. They had to be smarter. They had to be more disciplined than any white unit because they knew they would be judged by a harsher standard. Failure was not a personal option. It was a collective condemnation. The official designation for their training ground was Camp Gruber, Oklahoma. But for the men of the 333rd, it was simply the front line of their first war. This was a war not against a foreign enemy, but against the deeply ingrained prejudice of the United States Army itself. The goal of the camp's command structure and the surrounding Jim Crow environment was not to build them into the best soldiers they could be, but to test them to the breaking point, to validate the racist assumption that they were inherently unfit for the complexities of combat. Every aspect of their training was colored by this institutional skepticism. The physical environment was a challenge in itself. The Oklahoma heat was suffocating in the summer, the dust relentless. But it was the social environment that was truly hostile. Outside the gates of the camp, the men of the 333rd were subjected to the full, humiliating reality of the Jim Crow South. They were denied service in white-owned establishments, forced to use separate and inferior facilities, and constantly exposed to the threat of racial violence from the local population. A soldier in the uniform of the United States Army, a man training to fight and die for his country, could be arrested or beaten for simply trying to buy a drink at the wrong water fountain. This stark contradiction, being trained as a defender of freedom while being denied that very freedom yourself, was a daily, soul-crushing reality. Inside the camp, the racism was more structured, but no less potent. They were commanded by white officers, a military necessity in a segregated army that did not trust black men with leadership positions. While some of these officers were professional and fair, many brought their own prejudices with them. The men of the 333rd had to navigate a complex world of spoken and unspoken rules, constantly on guard, knowing that any perceived slight, any minor infraction, could be magnified and used as evidence of their collective failure. The training itself was brutal, designed to be as difficult as possible. Mastering the 155mm Long Tom howitzer was a monumental task. This was a beast of a weapon, weighing over 15 tons. It took a crew of 10 men to operate it, a perfectly synchronized ballet of loading, aiming, and firing. Each 95-pound shell had to be manhandled into the breech. The complex calculations for range and windage had to be done quickly and accurately under immense pressure. The instructors pushed them mercilessly, looking for any sign of weakness or incompetence. But a strange and powerful alchemy began to take place in that hostile environment. The constant pressure, the shared injustice, the knowledge that they were all in this together, began to forge the men of the 333rd into something more than just a military unit. They became a brotherhood. The shared struggle became the glue that bound them together with a fierce and unshakable loyalty. They developed a collective pride that was almost defiant in its intensity. If the white establishment expected them to fail, they would respond by becoming perfect. They drilled until their movements were flawless. They studied the complex firing tables and ballistic charts until they could recite them from memory. They learned to maintain their massive cannons with a meticulous care that bordered on obsession. They were not just trying to pass their training. They were trying to master their craft, to become so undeniably good that their race would become an afterthought. They were driven by an internal fire that their white counterparts, who took their place in the army for granted, could never truly understand. This intense focus and collective will produced results that began to astound their skeptical commanders. The gun crews of the 333rd became known for their speed, their accuracy, and their discipline. They could emplace their massive guns, fire a devastating barrage, and be ready to move in record time. They were not just meeting the standards. They were setting them, They were becoming one of the most effective and technically proficient artillery battalions in the entire U.S. Army, a fact that was both a source of immense pride for the men and a source of quiet cognitive dissonance for the command structure that had been so sure of their failure. After completing their initial training, they were moved to other camps for more advanced exercises, but the fundamental reality remained the same. They were a segregated unit, an island of black excellence in a sea of white military power. They were a weapon that the Army was forging, but a weapon it was still hesitant and unsure of how to use. For months, as the war raged in Europe and the Pacific, they remained stateside, their powerful guns silent, their skills untapped. The frustration grew. They had done everything that was asked of them, had exceeded every expectation, and yet they were still being held back. They had proven they were ready for war. The only question was whether the war was ready for them. Finally, in the summer of 1944, the call came. They were shipping out to Europe. They were finally going to get their chance to fight. Their arrival in Europe in the late summer of 1944 was not the glorious entry into combat they had hoped for. The Allied armies, having broken out from the Normandy beachheads, were now fighting a grinding, bloody campaign across France. The men of the 333rd, with their powerful 150mm guns, were a formidable asset, but they were a black asset, and the Army's command structure still treated them with a cautious, almost dismissive distance. They were assigned to General Patton's 3rd Army, a force renowned for its aggressive, fast-moving armored thrusts. But the 333rd was initially kept miles from the tip of the spear. Their first months were a frustrating exercise in rear echelon support. They fired long-range harassing missions, their massive shells arcing over the horizon to strike unseen targets designated by white forward observers. They were a disembodied force, a powerful tool that was kept out of sight. They saw the war through calculations and radio reports, hearing the sounds of battle, but rarely seeing its face. For men who had trained for 2 years to prove they were the best, this was a form of purgatory. They had crossed an ocean to fight, only to be told to wait in the wings. This all changed in the brutal winter of 1944. As the Allied advance stalled and the front line stabilized, the 333rd, along with its sister battalion, the 969th, were moved forward into the Ardennes forest. It was a rugged, densely wooded region on the border of Belgium and Luxembourg, and it was considered a ghost front, a quiet, static sector where battle-weary American divisions were sent to rest and refit. The 333rd was assigned to provide artillery support for the 106th Infantry Division, a green, untested unit that had just arrived in Europe. They set up their gun positions in the snow-dusted pine forests near the German border, a landscape lulled into a false sleep by the biting cold and the relative quiet of the front. That quiet was shattered on the morning of December 16th. In a thunderclap of artillery and armor, the German war machine roared back to life. Hitler had secretly amassed his last great armored reserve and unleashed it in a massive, desperate gamble through the Ardennes. The plan was to smash through the thinly held American lines, race to the sea, and split the Allied armies in two, forcing a negotiated peace. The offensive, which would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, was a masterpiece of surprise and overwhelming force. The American units holding the line, particularly the inexperienced 106th Division, were simply annihilated. Elite SS Panzer divisions, which Allied intelligence believed were a spent force, ripped through their defenses like a sledgehammer through glass. The American front line didn't just bend, it ceased to exist. What followed was a scene of mass chaos and panic. Entire regiments disintegrated. Thousands of soldiers were killed or captured. The survivors began a desperate, disorganized retreat, a human tide of terrified men streaming westward, trying to escape the German juggernaut. For the artillerymen of the 333rd, the battle was a terrifying roar on the horizon that was rapidly approaching. They heard the frantic radio calls for fire support, and they responded, firing their howitzers relentlessly to try and slow the German advance. But the infantry screens they were meant to be supporting were vanishing. Soon, the sounds of small arms fire and the clank of tank treads were no longer distant, but terrifyingly close. German stormtroopers and panzers were pouring through the gaps in the line, bypassing the main roads and flowing around the pockets of American resistance. The 333rd's gun positions were in imminent danger of being overrun. The textbook military procedure in such a situation is clear. When an artillery unit is about to be captured, its first duty is to save its men. They are to disable their guns to prevent them from falling into enemy hands and retreat to a new defensive position. But as the human tide of retreating white GIs, their faces, masks of shock and fear, streamed past their gun pits, the men of the 333rd received a different order. The command came down from the white officers of the Corps headquarters. The 333rd was to hold its position. All other units could retreat, but they were to stay. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. They were being asked to become a sacrificial wall of steel, to use their massive cannons as direct fire weapons against the advancing German tanks. Their mission was to stand and fight to the last man, to the last shell, to buy a few precious hours for the rest of the army to escape and form a new line of defense. They were being left behind to die. It was the ultimate test of a soldier's duty, a command to face certain annihilation for the sake of others. In the face of this suicidal order, the men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, the soldiers America never truly wanted, made their choice. They stood by their guns, and they obeyed. The order to stay was not a request. It was a final, brutal command. For the men of the 333rd, the world shrank to the confines of their snow-covered gun pits. The chaotic retreat of the white divisions around them faded into a backdrop of noise and motion. Their reality was now brutally simple. The German army was coming, and they were the only thing standing in its way. There was no hope of reinforcement, no possibility of escape. There was only the duty to fight and to die. What followed was one of the most unsung and heroic last stands of the entire war. The artillerymen, who had been trained for a war of mathematics and long-distance destruction, were now forced to become close-quarters brawlers. They depressed the barrels of their massive 155mm howitzers, aiming them horizontally down the narrow forest roads, a tactic so desperate it was barely ever trained for. They loaded their cannons not with standard high-explosive shells designed to arc over miles, but with direct fire rounds, turning their sophisticated artillery pieces into gigantic, immobile shotguns. As the lead elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Hitler's elite armored force, rumbled through the fog and snow, they were met with a cataclysmic surprise. A 95-pound shell, fired at point-blank range, is a force of pure annihilation. The German tanks and armored personnel carriers that expected to find only a panicked and retreating enemy were instead met with a wall of devastating fire. The 333rd's guns roared, their concussions shaking the frozen earth and shattering the pine trees around them. For a few crucial hours, in their small sector of the collapsing front, a handful of black artillery crews held back the tide. They fought with a cold, desperate fury, knowing every shell they fired was a beacon, drawing the full, overwhelming might of the German army down upon their heads. But the outcome was never in doubt. They were a single, isolated battalion against an entire armored division. The German Panzers, masters of blitzkrieg tactics, did not waste time with a frontal assault. They flowed around the 333rd's fixed positions, their infantry melting into the woods to flank the gun pits. Soon, the American artillerymen were fighting not just the tanks on the road, but the stormtroopers in the trees. The battle devolved into a chaotic 360-degree fight for survival. The gun crews were systematically overrun. The fighting became a desperate hand-to-hand struggle amidst the smoking breaches of the howitzers. The artillerymen used their carbines, their pistols, their knives, and their fists. They fought and died in the snow, their blood staining the frozen ground around the cannons they had refused to abandon. In the end, the sheer weight of the German numbers was overwhelming. Many were killed in the fighting. The rest, wounded, exhausted, their ammunition spent, were forced to surrender. They had obeyed their orders. They had bought the time their army had demanded, and now they were at the mercy of their enemy. But the men they had surrendered to were not from the regular German army. They were from the Waffen-SS, an organization steeped in a fanatical ideology of racial purity and utter ruthlessness. For the SS, the sight of black soldiers in American uniforms was a profound ideological offense. These were not soldiers to be treated according to the Geneva Conventions. They were, in the eyes of the Nazis, subhumans, an insult to their twisted vision of a master race. It was in the chaos of this surrender that the fates of the men of the 333rd splintered. Some were marched away to POW camps, their future uncertain. But for a small group of 11 men from the battalion's service battery, a different, far more horrific fate was waiting. These men, medics, drivers, and clerks, had been captured near the tiny Belgian hamlet of Wereth. They were taken not by the regular German army, but by a combat group from the infamous 1st SS Panzer Division, the same unit responsible for the Malmedy massacre of white American POWs. The 11 captured soldiers were forced to sit in the freezing cold, watching as the SS troops tended to their own wounded. Then, as darkness fell, they were marched into a nearby field. What happened next was not an act of war. It was a calculated, sadistic act of racial hatred. The men were brutally tortured. Their fingers were smashed. Their legs were broken. They were stabbed with bayonets, their bodies mutilated. After hours of unimaginable agony, they were executed, and their bodies were left to freeze in a ditch, a testament to the absolute evil they had been fighting against. The Wereth massacre was a secret that the falling snow and the chaos of battle would keep for months. The ultimate price of their service had been paid not just in the heat of combat, but in the cold, methodical cruelty of their captors. The sacrifice they had been ordered to make for their country had been completed by the hatred of their enemy. The story of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion should have ended there, in the snow-choked forests near St. Vith, a tragic tale of a unit sacrificed and annihilated. The official histories would have recorded them as another casualty of the German Ardennes offensive, their individual acts of heroism lost in the larger chaos of defeat. But history is not only written by the victors, it is also written by the survivors. And miraculously, against all odds, there were survivors. In the chaotic disintegration of the American front lines, a small, determined group of men from the 333rd's Battery C, along with other scattered soldiers from the battalion, had managed to do the impossible. They had escaped the German encirclement. This was no orderly retreat. It was a desperate flight through enemy territory. They were artillerymen, stripped of their primary weapon, their massive howitzers now smoking ruins in the hands of the enemy. They were a band of ghosts, armed only with their personal carbines and pistols, with no officers, no clear orders, and no friendly lines to fall back to. The entire world, it seemed, had become the front line. Their journey was an odyssey of pure survival. They moved through the dense, frozen forests of the Ardennes, a landscape that was now firmly behind enemy lines. They trudged through deep snowdrifts, the biting cold a constant gnawing enemy. They were freezing, exhausted, and running dangerously low on food and ammunition. During the day, they would hide, burrowing into the snow, staying silent as German patrols and tank columns passed just yards away. At night, they would move, using the stars and their wits to navigate westward, hoping to find a pocket of American resistance. a place to make a stand. After days of this grueling, terrifying trek, they stumbled out of the woods and found what they were looking for. It was not a safe rear area, but another island of desperation, the besieged crossroads town of Bastogne. Here, the 101st Airborne Division, the legendary Screaming Eagles, were completely surrounded by a ring of German armor and infantry. They were cut off, outnumbered, and being systematically pounded by enemy artillery. But they were refusing to surrender. For the exhausted survivors of the 333rd, Bastogne was both a refuge and a new battlefield. When they presented themselves to the hard-pressed paratroopers holding the perimeter, there were no questions about their unit or the color of their skin. The defenders of Bastogne were in a desperate fight for their lives, and they needed every man with a rifle. The arrival of these battle-hardened, if weaponless artillerymen was a welcome reinforcement. In a moment of pure battlefield pragmatism, the rigid walls of segregation crumbled. The men of the 333rd were immediately integrated into the defensive lines, handed ammunition, and assigned to foxholes alongside the white paratroopers. The artillerymen, who had been trained to calculate firing solutions for targets miles away, now found themselves staring down the barrels of German tanks a few hundred yards across a snowy field. They were infantrymen now, fighting a desperate, close-quarters battle for survival. They faced relentless German assaults, the winter air filled with the chatter of machine guns and the crump of mortar shells. They endured the constant, bone-jarring artillery barrages that turned the town and the surrounding woods into a cratered moonscape. In the frozen foxholes of Bastogne, a new brotherhood was forged. A white paratrooper from Tennessee found himself sharing his last K-ration with a black artilleryman from Alabama. They shared stories of home, they shared the terror of the incoming shells, and they shared the grim, determined task of holding the line. The prejudices and social codes of the world they had left behind seemed absurd and meaningless in the face of their shared struggle. What mattered was not where you were from, but whether you could be counted on when the enemy was charging your position. The men of the 333rd proved they could be counted on. They fought with a grim tenacity, their resolve steeled by the memory of the comrades they had lost. They were not just fighting for a town in Belgium. They were fighting for the honor of their shattered battalion. Their performance earned them the deep and lasting respect of the elite paratroopers they fought alongside. The Screaming Eagles were a famously tough and insular group, but in the crucible of that siege, they saw the men of the 333rd not as black soldiers, but simply as soldiers, as brothers in arms who had held the line with them. When General Patton's tanks finally broke through and lifted the siege on December 26th, the defenders of Bastogne were hailed as national heroes. They would forever be known as the Battered Bastards of Bastogne, a title of honor for the men who had refused to break. And among that legendary group, though their numbers were small and their story largely untold, were the surviving heroes of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. They had been left behind to die, their unit sacrificed. But they had not only survived, they had found their way to the heart of the American military's most legendary stand, and had, in the process, written a new and powerful chapter in their own incredible story. They had entered the Ardennes as a segregated artillery unit. They emerged from it as legendary American infantrymen. The end of the war in Europe should have been a moment of ultimate triumph and validation for the surviving men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion. They were not just victors, they were the living embodiment of the American spirit of resilience. They were the men who had been sacrificed and had refused to die. They had held the line against Hitler's elite panzers with their cannons at point-blank range. They had survived behind enemy lines in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. They had fought as infantrymen in the legendary defense of Bastogne, earning the highest honors alongside the celebrated 101st Airborne. They had borne witness to the horrific war crime at Wereth, a crime that exposed the true racist heart of the Nazi regime. They had, in short, a story so powerful, so cinematic, so profoundly American that it should have been etched into the national memory. But the America of 1945, in its rush to celebrate a clean, unified victory, had no room for a story that was so messy, so painful, and so challenging to its own racial conscience. As the histories of the good war were being written, a great and deliberate act of forgetting took place. The narrative needed to be simple. A united America, the greatest generation, had come together to save the world. The inconvenient truths of a segregated military, of black soldiers who had to fight a war on two fronts, were systematically smoothed over, marginalized, and erased. The story of the 333rd became one of the most glaring casualties of this historical amnesia. While the band of brothers of the 101st Airborne became immortalized in books and films for their heroic stand at Bastogne, the crucial role of the black artillerymen who had fought and bled in the same frozen foxholes was almost completely written out of the story. They were the ghosts of Bastogne, their contributions rendered invisible in the official accounts. The integrated brotherhood that had been forged in the heat of battle was resegregated by the cold indifference of history. Even more shocking was the burial of the Wereth massacre. The story of the Malmedy massacre, where white American POWs were murdered by the same SS division, became a national symbol of Nazi evil. It was a central focus of the Nuremberg trials, a permanent part of the American memory of the war. But the story of the 11 black soldiers of the 333rd, who were not just executed, but brutally tortured in a racially motivated hate crime, vanished. There was no national outcry. There were no major headlines. Their names were not read into the congressional record. Their sacrifice, as profound and as horrific as any other, was deemed unworthy of the same level of national mourning and remembrance. It was a final, terrible act of segregation, a line drawn between which lives and which deaths truly mattered. For the veterans of the 333rd, this was a silent, agonizing betrayal. They returned home not to the parades and accolades they had earned, but to a Jim Crow nation that was in many ways unchanged. The skills they had learned, the leadership they had shown, the courage they had proven, all of it meant nothing once they took off the uniform. They were denied the full benefits of the GI Bill, redlined out of suburbs, and faced with the same systemic racism they had left behind. And they carried the heavy, unspoken burden of their story. How do you talk about being left behind by your own army? How do you describe the horror of finding your comrades tortured and executed in a ditch? How do you explain the brotherhood you found in a foxhole with a white paratrooper to a world that insists on seeing you as separate and inferior? So for decades, they remained silent. They did what millions of veterans do. They went on with their lives. They raised families, worked jobs, and became pillars of their communities. Their incredible story became a private memory, a heavy piece of their past shared only in quiet moments with family, or at reunions with the few men who truly understood. They were heroes in hiding, their epic saga a secret history of World War II, but a story that powerful, a truth that profound, cannot be buried forever. The first keepers of the flame were not in America, but in the small Belgian village of Wereth. The Langer family, who had risked their own lives to give the 11 soldiers a few moments of shelter before their capture, had made a solemn promise to honor them. For decades, they tended to the site of the massacre, creating a humble, handmade cross. They passed the story down to their children and grandchildren. They became the unlikely guardians of a piece of American history that America itself had chosen to discard. The long process of rediscovery in the United States was a slow, grassroots effort, driven by the aging veterans themselves, their families, and a handful of dedicated local historians. It was a fight against the inertia of official history, a painstaking effort to piece together a story from scattered records, fading memories, and the quiet testimony of men who had been silent for too long. They were fighting not for fame or fortune, but for a simple, powerful idea that the truth must be told, that their brothers, the men of Wereth, and all the others who had fallen, deserved to have their sacrifice remembered and their names honored. Their final war was a war for memory itself, the flame that had been kept alive for half a century by the quiet dignity of a Belgian family and the stubborn persistence of aging veterans finally began to catch the attention of a wider world in the 1990s. The approaching 50th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge sparked a new wave of historical interest in the war, and a new generation of historians, armed with a more critical and inclusive perspective, began to look for the stories that had been left out of the traditional narratives. The story of the Hellfighters from Hell was a story waiting to be found. The turning point came from the most unlikely of places. A Belgian doctor named Herman Langer, the son of the very farmer who had discovered the bodies of the Wereth 11, had grown up with the story. For him, it was not an abstract piece of history. It was a sacred local memory. He made it his life's mission to ensure that the sacrifice of these 11 men was given a permanent and honorable tribute. His passionate, grassroots campaign began to gain traction, connecting with American historians, filmmakers, and most importantly, the families of the veterans themselves. This transatlantic effort, a collaboration between the people of a small Belgian village and the descendants of the soldiers who had been murdered there, was a powerful force. Documentaries began to be produced. Articles were written. The story of the 333rd and the Wereth massacre began to seep into the American consciousness for the first time. The Congressional Black Caucus took up the cause, demanding that the Army and the government officially investigate and recognize what had happened. The pressure mounted, and the wall of official silence began to crumble. In 2004, a beautiful and powerful new memorial was dedicated in Wereth, Belgium. It was built not by any government, but through private donations from citizens in both America and Belgium who had been moved by the story. It stands today, a striking monument of black granite, listing the names of the 11 fallen soldiers. It is one of the only, and perhaps the most significant, memorials in Europe dedicated specifically to the sacrifice of African American soldiers in World War II. It is a testament to the fact that while governments may forget, humanity remembers. The dedication of the Wereth Memorial was a catalyst. It brought the story to an even wider audience and increased the pressure on the U.S. government to act. The final official act of recognition came in 2017. After a long and detailed review by Army historians, a review that confirmed the extraordinary heroism of the 333rd during their last stand and the racially motivated nature of the Wereth massacre, the United States Army finally bestowed upon the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion the Presidential Unit Citation. 73 years after they had been ordered to sacrifice themselves to save their fellow soldiers, their country finally, officially, said thank you. It was a moment of profound, if deeply belated justice. The citation praised their extraordinary heroism and gallantry in action, acknowledging their suicidal last stand and their crucial role in slowing the German advance. So what then is the ultimate legacy of these Hellfighters from Hell? It is a story of almost unbearable complexity, a narrative that forces us to confront the best and the worst of the American experience. First and foremost, it is a legacy of sacrifice. These men were given a suicide mission, and they carried it out with a level of courage that is almost beyond comprehension. They were a shield, and they did not break. Their last stand is a testament to the highest ideals of a soldier's duty, a duty they fulfilled even when they knew they had been left behind. It is also a legacy of the brutal reality of racial hatred. The Wereth massacre was not a random act of war. It was a hate crime, a direct and horrific expression of the Nazi ideology of a master race. The torture and murder of these 11 men is a stark and necessary reminder of what was truly at stake in the war. They died as victims of the same poisonous ideology that fueled both the Holocaust in Europe and the system of Jim Crow in America. Their gravesite in Belgium is sacred ground in the global ongoing fight for racial justice. But their legacy is not only one of tragedy, it is also one of incredible triumph. The story of the survivors who fought at Bastogne is a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Having been through a trauma that would have broken most men, they chose to fight again. Their impromptu battlefield integration with the 101st Airborne was a small, perfect glimpse of a future American military. A future where a soldier's worth was measured by his courage, not his color. They were pioneers, not by choice, but by circumstance, and their performance in that frozen hell helped to lay the groundwork for the eventual desegregation of the armed forces. Finally, their long, 70-year journey from forgotten heroes to celebrated icons is a powerful lesson in the persistence of historical truth. Their story was buried, but it never died. It was kept alive by the quiet faith of ordinary people and the stubborn determination of those who refused to let their sacrifice be in vain. Their story is proof that history is not a fixed monument, but a living, breathing thing that can be corrected, that can be made more honest. The men of the 333rd were left behind in the snows of the Ardennes, and they were left behind in the first drafts of history. But they have, at long last, been brought home. We began this story with an order that was both a death sentence and a testament to honor. Stay. The men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion obeyed, and in doing so, stepped into a crucible that would test the very limits of human endurance and courage. Their story did not end in the snows of the Ardennes, nor in the shallow grave at Wereth. It is a story that has journeyed through decades of silence to emerge today as a powerful and necessary part of the American epic, a narrative that challenges us, inspires us, and forces us to reckon with the complex truths of our own history. The legacy of the 333rd is a profound lesson in the nature of heroism. Theirs was not the heroism of a glorious flag-waving charge. It was the harder, grittier heroism of the last stand. It was the courage to do one's duty in the face of certain death, to hold a position, not for the hope of victory, but for the sake of the men retreating behind you. This is a form of sacrifice that is almost biblical in its scope. They were, in that moment, the keepers of their brothers, and they paid the ultimate price for that loyalty. Their story is also a stark and uncomfortable mirror, reflecting the deep and painful hypocrisy that has always been at the heart of the American struggle with race. These men were deemed worthy enough to die for their country, but not worthy enough to be remembered by it. The decades of official silence that followed their sacrifice is an indictment of a system that was more comfortable with their deaths than with the challenging truth of their heroism. The contrast between the fame of the Malmedy massacre and the obscurity of the Wereth massacre is a painful but necessary lesson in how narratives are constructed and how some stories are deemed more important than others. To remember the 333rd is to commit an act of historical justice, to insist that all sacrifice, regardless of the color of the skin of those who made it, has equal weight and equal honor. But the story of the survivors of Bastogne prevents this from being only a tale of tragedy. It is a powerful narrative of rebirth and redemption. From the ashes of their annihilated battalion, these men rose to fight again, their courage undiminished. Their seamless integration into the defense of that besieged town is a powerful symbol of an ideal America, a glimpse of a nation where shared purpose and mutual respect can overcome the deepest divisions. In those frozen foxholes, they were not black soldiers or white soldiers. They were simply American soldiers. That small, perfect moment of battlefield equality was the very ideal that the war was supposedly being fought to defend. So, when we tell the story of the Battle of the Bulge, let us tell the whole story. Let us speak not only of the paratroopers of the 101st, but of the artillerymen of the 333rd who stood with them. When we speak of the horrors of Nazi war crimes, let us say the names of the 11 men murdered at Wereth with the same reverence we give to the victims of Malmedy. And when we speak of the greatest generation, let us remember that its greatness is found not just in its triumphs, but in its most difficult and often hidden stories of sacrifice and injustice. The men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion were not just soldiers. They were a testament. They were a testament to the fact that courage knows no color. They were a testament to the fact that duty can be fulfilled even in the face of ultimate betrayal. And they were a testament to the fact that the truth, no matter how long it is buried, will eventually find its way into the light. They were ordered to stay, and so their story stays with us, a permanent and powerful reminder of the cost of freedom, the price of hatred, and the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. They were the Hellfighters from hell, and their long war for recognition is finally over. Their place in the pantheon of American heroes is, at long last, secure. The end of World War II was not the end of the war for the 333rd. It was merely the beginning of a different, longer, and quieter battle. This was a war fought not in the snows of the Ardennes, but in the cold corridors of bureaucracy and the silent pages of history books. It was a war for memory itself, a struggle against the great collective amnesia that threatened to swallow their sacrifice whole. While the nation celebrated a simplified, unified story of the greatest generation, the complex and challenging truth of the Hellfighters from hell was systematically filed away, ignored, and forgotten. For decades, the story existed only in fragments, kept alive by the quiet determination of those who could not forget. The most unlikely and faithful guardians of this memory were not in America, but in the small Belgian village of Wereth. The Langer family, who had offered the 11 soldiers their last moments of kindness, had made a solemn vow. They tended to the makeshift gravesite where the men had been found, treating it as sacred ground. They passed the story down through generations, a local legend of American heroes that America itself did not know. They were the keepers of a promise, a small flame of remembrance in a world of historical darkness. In America, the surviving veterans of the 333rd and the 761st formed associations, holding reunions that were part therapy, part historical preservation. In these gatherings, among the only men who could truly understand, they retold the stories. They spoke of the last stand, of the siege of Bastogne, and in hushed, reverent tones, they spoke of the men of Wereth. They were fighting to keep their own history from becoming a ghost. The first major battle in this new war was the fight for the honor of Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers of the 761st, but his struggle was symbolic of all the forgotten black heroes. His commanding officer, Captain David Williams, a white man from a family of Georgia preachers, had been haunted for decades by the Army's denial of Rivers' Medal of Honor. He had recommended him twice, witnessed his supreme valor with his own eyes, and had seen the recommendation vanish. Williams embarked on a personal crusade, a 30-year campaign of writing letters, contacting politicians, and giving interviews, refusing to let the injustice stand. His fight was a lonely one, a testament to the battlefield brotherhood that transcended race. The tide began to turn in the 1970s and 80s as the civil rights movement forced a broader reckoning with America's racial past. The first crack in the official wall of silence came in 1978 when President Jimmy Carter awarded the 761st Tank Battalion the Presidential Unit Citation. It was a monumental, if belated, acknowledgement of their extraordinary combat record. But the deeper stories of sacrifice, particularly the Wereth massacre and the individual heroism of men like Reuben Rivers, remained largely in the shadows. The final breakthrough came in the 1990s. Spurred by a new generation of historians and the relentless pressure from the Congressional Black Caucus, the U.S. Army commissioned a formal review to determine if racial bias had played a role in the awarding of medals during World War II. The evidence they uncovered was overwhelming. They found a systemic pattern of black soldiers being denied the highest honors, their valorous acts often downgraded to lesser medals or simply ignored. This official review reopened the case of Reuben Rivers. Captain Williams, now an old man, provided his final, powerful testimony. The lost paperwork was reconstructed, the battle reports were re-examined, and the evidence of Rivers's heroism was found to be irrefutable. In 1997, at a solemn White House ceremony, President Bill Clinton posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, placing it in the hands of his surviving family. 53 years after he had died in his tank, his nation finally recognized his sacrifice. It was a victory not just for one man, but for every forgotten soldier who had fought the war on two fronts. This momentum carried over to the story of the 333rd. The grassroots effort in Belgium, combined with new research in America, finally brought the story of Wereth to the attention of the U.S. Congress. In 2017, after decades of being a historical ghost story, the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion was finally awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for their heroic last stand, and the Senate passed a resolution officially acknowledging the 11 men murdered at Wereth, calling them martyrs for the cause of freedom. The long, quiet war for recognition had, at long last, been won. We began this story with an order that was both a death sentence and a testament to honor. Stay. The men of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion obeyed, and in doing so, they wrote a chapter of American history in courage and in blood. Their story, rescued from the depths of a forgotten past, does not just add to our understanding of World War II, it fundamentally challenges it. It forces us to see that epic struggle not as a simple tale of good versus evil, but as a complex, messy, and profoundly human drama filled with both incredible valor and heartbreaking injustice. The legacy of these Hellfighters from Hell is a powerful testament to the multifaceted nature of courage. There was the hot, explosive courage of their last stand, firing their cannons point blank into the face of an overwhelming enemy. But there was also the cold, desperate courage of the survivors, fighting their way through a frozen wilderness to rejoin the war. There was the quiet, dignified courage of the veterans who spent a lifetime fighting for the memory of their fallen brothers. And there was the profound courage of the Belgian family, who became the guardians of a truth that the most powerful nation on earth had chosen to discard. Their story is a permanent and necessary scar on the celebratory narrative of the greatest generation. It reminds us that for nearly 1 million African American soldiers, the war against fascism abroad could never be fully separated from the war against racism at home. They were men who fought for a double victory, and the fact that they fought with such unwavering loyalty for a nation that had not yet granted them the full measure of their own freedom makes their sacrifice all the more profound. They were not just fighting for a country. They were fighting for the idea of a country, a more perfect union that they hoped their sacrifice would help to build. So, when we remember the heroes of the Battle of the Bulge, let us remember the men of the 333rd. When we speak of the legendary stand at Bastogne, let us speak the names of the black artillerymen who held the line in those frozen foxholes. And when we condemn the horrific war crimes of the Nazi regime, let us say the names of the 11 men of the Wereth massacre with the same reverence and sorrow we reserve for any other American martyr. They were James Stewart, Dew W. Turner, Curtis Adams, William Pritchett, George Davis, Thomas J. Fort, Robert Greene, James Aubrey, George W. Moten, Joseph Smallwood, and Johnny L. Leatherwood. Their names matter. Their story matters. The journey of the 333rd, from sacrificial lambs to forgotten ghosts to celebrated heroes, is a testament to the fact that history is not a static monument. It is a living conversation, and sometimes it takes generations for the quietest voices to finally be heard. They were ordered to stay. And so their story stays with us, a permanent and powerful reminder of the cost of freedom, the price of hatred, and the unbreakable resilience of the human spirit. They were, in every sense, Hellfighters from hell, men who walked through the worst of humanity and emerged not as victims, but as timeless symbols of an indomitable will to fight, to survive, and ultimately to be remembered.